I was a naval officer and a naval flight officer in the 1970s, and I just can't, it's hard to describe how disappointing and disillusioning it was to find out that Duke Cunningham had been doing these things, because to every one of us who was a young pilot or flight officer during the 70s, it's been a long time now and people forget, but everyone knew and admired and looked up to and wanted to be like Duke Cunningham and his Rio, whose name was Driscoll. Everybody knew who they were, and wherever they went, they were mobbed. And to see a man like that...
Well, thank you for joining me. Randy Duke Cunningham was a distinguished American fighter pilot and America's first ace in the Vietnam War. Later, he was elected a U.S. Republican congressman from California, and unfortunately became unquestionably one of the most corrupt politicians to ever walk the halls of Congress, a title for which many men have contended. The Duke included a bribery menu on his business card, where defense contracts could be ordered just like choosing food on a menu. This was evidence in his indictment. The left column represents the millions of dollars of government contracts he could secure. The right column is the tens of thousands of dollars in bribes required to secure the contract, and the bribery amounts listed are the increases as you go up the scale. So you see a sliding scale of $50,000 increases. You start getting a discount at $21 million in contracts by only having to bribe an increase of $25,000. The BT is an abbreviation for buoy toy, a 42-foot yacht that defense contractor Mitch Wade of MZM Corporation gave Cunningham in exchange for $16 million in federal defense contracts. Cunningham renamed the buoy toy the Dukester and moored it on the Washington waterfront, where he would entertain women. I'm telling you about this only because of my personal connection to this story, which I'm going to share with you. My intent is to no way denigrate the legacy of this Vietnam flying ace. He did that himself. I'm just telling you a factual story, and God rest his soul. Cunningham's corruption was, as the Washington Post called it, the most brazen bribery conspiracy in modern congressional history. It is widely assumed he had assistance from congressional staffers to pull this off. And during this video, I'll play you some C-SPAN footage of this and other interesting components of this story.
One is that a great deal of money was directed by Mr. Cunningham through this particular committee to the fellows who were bribing him, and they put a figure on it for the first time for this committee, which was $70 to $80 million. The other thing we learned, and I think again sort of confirms for us, is that we learned that but for the cooperation, the assistance, the help of the staff on this committee, he could not have done what he did. And that they had all kinds of suspicions, they had red flags, they had grave concerns, and they had a sense that this was a waste of taxpayer money, and yet they went ahead and they did his bidding anyway.
Okay, let's go back over that. You're saying that without the staff of this intelligence committee that Randall Duke Cunningham was a member of, he could not have spread this money around like he did.
That is the conclusion of the general counsel who did the investigation.
Who are they pointing the finger at? Anybody specific?
They did not name names. They said they referred to them as individuals on the committee. They did not name names, and the focus, the scope of this inquiry was very specific. It was to take a look at the staffers on the intelligence committee to see if any of them were culpable. And what it did is it came to the conclusion it couldn't have been that Cunningham couldn't have done this without their help over all these years, despite their concerns and about the integrity and the propriety of not only what they were doing, but the people who were asking them to do it, or the person who was asking them to do it. They still went ahead and they put through this money. You know, and so it's curious. He came to the conclusion that there was no reason to refer this matter to the Justice Department on any of these unnamed individuals.
In 2005, Cunningham pled guilty to bribery, fraud, and tax evasion, having received over $2.4 million in bribes through a variety of methods, including checks totaling over $1 million, cash, rugs, antiques, furniture, yacht club fees, 2 antique Louis Philippe Restoration period commodes, boat repairs, moving costs, and vacation expenses. He was sentenced to 8 years and 4 months in prison, the longest jail term ever given to a former congressman. This article appeared in September 2006, Capital Crime, How a New Washington Scandal Could Bring Congress to Its Knees. Not only did this scandal bring down Cunningham, but also the number 3 man at the CIA, Kyle Fogo, and several others. The primary conspirator paying the bribes was Mitch Wade, the owner of MZM Corporation, a Washington, D.C. defense contractor. This U.S. News and World Report article says, Wade's close ties to former senior officials of a Pentagon agency, the Counterintelligence Field Activity, or CFA, which helps identify and thwart terrorists and spies, are also being examined. So is his relationship with a defense contractor called Greyhawk Systems. Greyhawk obtained several lucrative and questionable contracts from CFA, which it then shared with MZM. Well, I worked for Greyhawk at CFA during this period and left there to work at MZM during this period. I batted a triple, but I didn't get the home run.
The report says that the members of the committee staff were concerned about how Cunningham might affect their priorities, their other programs that they wanted to have funded because of his presence, his seat on the House Appropriations subcommittee that handles the Pentagon budget. And so they were fearful, apparently, that unless they placated him in what he wanted in this regard with the 2 contractors, then he would make life difficult for them in areas that may to them have been more important. There's a parallel between this, Brian, and what we saw with Cunningham's pressure over at the Pentagon, where we know from an Inspector General's investigation and from our own reporting that Cunningham, in the words of several people, bullied people at the Pentagon to make sure that they took money away from programs that they intended to fund and directed it to Brent Wilkes, this contractor in San Diego.
Here's how the bribery scheme would work. Mitch Wade would pay the congressman a bribe for an earmark, which is a congressional budgetary provision inserted into a discretionary spending appropriations bill that directs funds to a specific recipient, circumventing the normal appropriations process. After Wade got the yacht for the congressman got MZM a 5-year special contracting vehicle called a blanket purchasing agreement that allowed MZM to receive up to $225 million in contracts without competitive bidding. So the Duke was creating defense contracts for MZM, no competition. In one particular case that I am quite familiar with, frankly, Mitch Wade and the congressman burst into the office of the CFA director, who was never implicated in this scandal, telling the director that an earmark for, I forget how many millions of dollars it was, for a specific project that was being given to his agency, CFA, and that MZM would be the contractor. The CFA director replied to Wade and the Duke, "We don't need this capability." The congressman said, "Yeah, I think you do. It's done. See you later." These kinds of shenanigans are in this article. I will email it to you. MZM was a top-of-the-line defense contractor who only hired employees if they were recommended by a current MZM employee. So kind of like the mafia, I guess. You had to be made. MZM had sky-high labor rates. It charged the government because of the senior-level expertise it provided the government and the high salaries it provided employees. The article says Wade hired the creme de la creme of former government agents, intelligence officers, and soldiers. The level of people they had, it was a government within a government. MZM did only hire the best, so there were no junior people, only seasoned senior professionals. The MZM headquarters was an opulent, old Victorian mansion in the artsy DuPont Circle area of Washington, D.C. There was a grand Steinway piano in the entry, and I remember so many old antiques, and particularly a display case that held an old invitation to President Grant's first inauguration. I was always amazed with that. And of course, there were photos of Wade, the owner, with cabinet secretaries, members of Congress, and others. I only met the owner, Wade, once, when key staff was sneaking him out the back door because the Washington Post was camped out on our front doorstep. There was a foreign embassy butted up against us, so I'm not for sure how he got out of there. I remember my job interview with MZM. As I said, I was working for Greyhawk at CIFA and got connected, and MZM's chief operating officer, the COO, interviewed me in his opulent office in the lavish headquarters of MZM. He was a good man. He was never caught up in this scandal. I don't think he ever did anything wrong. When I walked in, I don't think that he remembered me, but when he was an Army colonel and I was a lieutenant at Fortress Bragg, we had served together in an airborne unit. So I remembered him, but we had had little contact at that time. And when I mentioned this at the beginning of the interview, he, of course, said, oh yeah. The interview was just a formality. If you made it this far, you were in. After 3 or 4 minutes of small talk, he asked me my salary requirements. I said, between $130,000 and $150,000. And in a few days, I received an offer letter of $140,000, which I took. Wade and MZM were flamboyant in everything they did, and nothing symbolized the affluence like Christmas, when employees received gifts of spiral cut ham and tiered boxes of Godiva chocolates in the mail. The Wades hosted a black tie gala at the Watergate or Four Seasons Hotel, complete with MZM carolers, a jazz quartet, and one year even a 19-piece swing band. Greyhawk Christmas parties were quite the extravagant affairs as well, but not to this degree. At the MZM party, employees sat at a flower and candle bedecked table laden with crystal champagne and Christmas ornaments from Tiffany for the wives. The size of the shrimp hors d'oeuvres were enormous. There were expensive door prizes, including cameras, flat screen TVs, and exotic vacation packages. After dining, certain employees took turns paying tribute to the boss. Now, the congressman, the Duke, was a regular fixture at Christmas parties each year, as were other top defense officials and members of Congress, to whom, or veterans of the Iraq War, I should say, to whom Cunningham once presented rare silver coins. The Duke, after imbibing several of the select wines that he required Wade to produce, would recount stories of courage and perseverance, of how he shot down 4 enemy planes during the Vietnam War. But the story eventually lost its poignancy for some in the audience who noticed that Cunningham always cried on cue at the same points in the narrative. And you'll notice that a lot about the congressman in his interviews, and he can cry quite quickly. Between my job interview and reporting to work, the dam had broken in the press, and MZM was so toxic, the government client for whom I was to work would no longer accept MZM employees. Just so you know how government contracting works, we, individual contractors, would work for a company, say British Aerospace Engineering, as I later did, who had a contract with the federal government, and we would work on a government client site, DIA, CIA, wherever. And all my time was with the Department of Defense, some of it at the Pentagon. You almost never visited, actually, your company headquarters, who you worked for, and who paid you. All that mattered was that the government client whose site you were on was happy with your work, because the government essentially paid your salary and the company as well. So I'm stuck at MZM headquarters, not having a position to go to, no government site, and I was placed in the MZM basement, along with 3 other recent hires in the same boat. It felt like an end days bunker might. And I remember a wine rack with all these old vintage wines. I sometimes was tempted to grab one. We each were certain we had to find new jobs. The end was near. There was no supervision, no accountability. I remember once or twice per week, my new bunker mates would huddle over a Washington Post, whispering among themselves, and then they'd be gone for a couple of hours around lunchtime. After a week or so, they took me into their confidence and pulled me over one day for their paper viewing. They were selecting lectures to attend once or twice per week at nearby think tanks. The Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, Brookings, and other lectures that you see on C-SPAN. I remember looking at 2 potential lectures that day. One looked very good, and I asked, hey, are we going to that one? One guy said, oh, no. Cato Institute has a much better lunch spread. You see, these institutes provided free food after the lectures. That's how they got people there to attend. And while they were finger foods, yeah, they were quite good. And for this old airborne guy, they were quite good. So I learned how to choose lecture topics and locations based on the quality of food. Who knew? A few weeks later, we received good news, actually. Mitch Wade, the owner, was stepping down for the good of the company, putting MZM in some kind of receivership, and the COO was taking over. And this was supposed to give the company some breathing space. That month, June 2005, on a Friday, we had an annual company picnic at a DC park. And like all MZM affairs, this one was very high class, with a noted Washington chef catering it and even passing out signed copies of his cookbook, which no doubt MZM paid for. Now, leaving the picnic, I followed standard military protocol. I went up and I thanked the COO, and after a minute of small talk, he said, Paul, I'm going to bring you close to me. Well, I was thrilled. MZM was not only going to survive, but I was going to be in the inner circle, probably because I was a paratrooper with the COO from way back, even though he didn't really remember me. And these were treacherous times. It was hard to know who to trust, and he and I were cut from the same military airborne cloth at Fortress Bragg. Well, I was on cloud 9, frankly, and I had a great weekend. Well, on Monday morning, I arrived to MZM headquarters, to a man in the main hallway taking down pictures of Wade with all the political celebrities that graced the wall. Behind him, a spackler, and then a painter was following to clean up the walls. And I heard this dull roar. Well, I went downstairs and asked my bunker mates what was happening. Well, it seems that Wade had refused to give up the company and the COO had resigned. There goes my opportunity. Shortly thereafter, on 1 July, the FBI raided our headquarters. Fun times if you've never been raided by the FBI. And it was all over but the crime, indictments and jail time. And it gets even weirder. On the day Cunningham pled guilty in November 2005, an article came out disclosing that the White House Executive Office previously had awarded several contracts to MZM, including a $140,000 deal for office furniture in 2002 and several for unspecified intelligence services. Why would the White House hire a defense and intelligence firm to buy office furniture? I moved on to another company. MZM was bought by another defense contractor and continued operations under another name. It was a sad affair indeed that a once American hero, a flying ace, had become so greedy and ended up in jail. Now, there are many articles on this sordid affair. I'm happy to email you this one. It's kind of special because although the saga continued after this article, this one covers the episodes, the events, and the depth of corruption very well. Cunningham was pardoned by President Trump in 2021, but by then his life was nearly over. He only died a couple of months ago, and God rest his soul. He paid a heavy, heavy price for what he did. And Mitch Wade, he served time in prison as well. As always, thank you for watching.
You got a private letter here. It's dateline 18 September 2006 from Randall Cunningham, and it actually gives his number. What is that, 94405-148?
I guess so, yes.
Yeah. What is this letter about?
Well, I had written to Mr. Cunningham. There's, you know, he went off to jail, and when he did, he wept, but he didn't really, you know, sing. He didn't answer a lot of questions about how he did what he did. He didn't answer. We didn't know the extent of the damage to the country, either the cost or in terms of security, and we had no idea how he was able to pull this off. And by that I mean hundreds of millions of dollars being steered to defense contractors who in return gave him millions of dollars. And so there were a lot of follow-up questions that I wanted to pursue with him.
And what did this letter say?
Well, it's in 4 pages. It says no, you know, and I think that his attorney probably would have preferred that he did not respond with anything more than no if he had to respond, but he did. And I think that what we can see in here is a guy who's deeply anguished, whose life is completely collapsed, and who recognizes somehow that he played a role in his own downfall, but at this point his bitterness is directed toward everybody but himself.
Jerry Kemmer, in this letter, it says, each time you print, it hurts my family, and now I have lost them along with everything I have worked for during my 64 years. I am human, not an animal to keep whipping.
I think that struck us all as the voice of a man in deep anguish over his situation. Everything that he had accomplished and everything he had acquired over the years in a career that began really when he was an ace fighter pilot in Vietnam and parlayed that into a congressional career and great power in this town, it all collapsed around him because of his corruption. But we certainly felt that we were not pursuing Mr. Cunningham's family. We were trying to do everything we could to understand how this corruption developed, who aided it, who abetted it, and what were the systematic problems and what was the systematic environment in which this flourished and was allowed to continue.
At the end of the letter, he says, do not expect me to show up so you can kill me and my family. And then he signs it, Randall Cunningham, and his number, I will not meet with you at Butner.
And that's the prison where he's incarcerated. Yeah, I would add, Jerry, that that what it also reflects is a feeling that he is being victimized by the media, and on some level, he's still looking at this as a crime committed by the media against him, as opposed to him having committed a crime against the public.